Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along to the webinar this evening. I'm really excited to be here. It's been a few months since I've been part of a Curlew Action webinar, so it's really lovely to be back. I'm going to start off by introducing our panelists. Obviously, this evening we are going to be talking about recreational disturbance and curlews, but also wider wildlife as well. So we have three expert panelists this evening. We've got Dr. Becky Thomas, who is a senior lecturer at Royal Holloway University of London, and her research interests focus on how people's decisions affect the ecology of wild species. And some of her recent research, which we're going to be hearing quite a lot about this evening, has focused on understanding the effects of dog walking on lowland heath habitats. So, Becky, thank you so much for joining us. We have also got Nikki Buckland, who has been working for the Thames Basin Heaths Partnership for 10 years as a ground warden engaging with special protection area visitors, and 2 years as communications officer. And her project works to raise awareness of rare ground nesting heathland birds. And our third panelist, who some of you might recognise because she's been part of some of our webinars before, we have the wonderful Leigh Weston, who is a farmer up in Malham in Yorkshire, and her farm looks over the famous Malham Cove, so obviously has quite a lot of footfall there. And amongst the various other wildlife that Leigh has on her farm, she also has breeding curlew. So thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us. It's going to be a really, really interesting conversation. And before I hand over to our speakers, who are each going to give a quick presentation about their work, I'm just going to give a short overview about why we're hosting this webinar. So tonight's webinar is part of a series of webinars that Curlew Action runs almost every month. And these webinars discuss different conservation topics that affect curlews and other wildlife as well. And for anyone who's not familiar with Curlew Action is a very small charity set up in 2019 by Mary Colwell, which is working to reverse the decline of curlew. And the problems that curlews are facing in the UK and across the world are pretty varied. Here in the UK, we've seen a massive decline in curlew numbers. So since the 1980s, we've lost about 60% in England and Scotland, over 80% in Wales, and nearly 90% in Ireland. And the problem that curlews are facing is really low productivity. If they make it to adulthood, they actually have a really good chance of survival and they can live for a really long time, but they're just not getting enough chicks and eggs off the ground. And there's lots of different reasons for that. So predation, intensification of agriculture, habitat loss through things like afforestation and building development, increased flooding events during the breeding season. They're really, really up against it. And a lot of these big topics have been discussed in Curlew Action's previous webinars. But with curlew productivity so low, every single chick and egg is precious. And because they nest on the ground, they're really vulnerable to disturbance from us, which is why we're going to be having this conversation this evening. And it's why we're going to be focusing largely on the breeding areas and during the breeding season, because that's the critical point in the curlew's life cycle. And it's also something that we can all do our bit to support. Wherever you live, we can all be doing some work to reduce disturbance on not just curlews, but wildlife as well. So I'm now going to hand over to three people who know a lot more about this topic than I do. So Becky, should we start with your presentation?
Great, thank you, Ellen. Thank you very, very much for the introduction. My name is Dr. Becky Thomas, and I have been researching kind of how people influence wildlife for quite a few years now. My PhD was focusing on the effects of domestic cat predation on wildlife. And then since then, I've kind of built upon that and worked with lots of different species. The reason that I started working with dogs was actually an experience where I went out birding and I was looking for Dartford warbler in Farnham Heath. And I was successful and I was looking at one with my binoculars. And as I was there, a man sort of came at the back of me and he had these 4 massive golden retrievers and just let all 4 of them off the lead. And I could just see all 4 of them just off roaming into the habitat. And I could see that the disturbance that was causing. And so I started to work with the partners that we worked with on the project to kind of look at what dogs were doing essentially in these environments. So introduction. So I think I'm talking to an audience who already knows about this, but we're aware that as human population densities grow, we know that there's a huge amount of human disturbance that happens as we get all these people living alongside our wildlife. Dogs are really dominant companion animals, so more probably comparable in numbers with domestic cats, probably around 12 million of them in the UK at the moment. And we know that dog walking is really, really common in areas of high conservation value, especially when those areas are present near areas of high housing density. And that's a particular issue in the area that I'm in. So I may be from Holloway, University of London, but we're actually based in Egham in Surrey, and we have quite a few lowland heaths around this particular area. And we know that there's high levels of human density in these areas too, and high amounts of dog walking. In the study that we did, we wanted essentially to take those areas of lowland heath and to try and work out that you've got your area, but actually what proportion of that area is disturbed frequently by people walking and then their dogs walking. So we essentially wanted to model where people were going and then where their dogs were going off the lead around those people. So we wanted to kind of quantify the disturbance and essentially work out what areas were being frequently disturbed in these particular reserves, because obviously the idea would be that that could help with management of these particular issues. To do that, we use these small GPS trackers. We tracked both the dogs and the dog walkers. Surprisingly, people were really, really keen on this. They really enjoyed being tracked for some reason. And we had lots and lots of willing volunteers to do it. Here's an image of one of the dogs that we tracked here. He doesn't look quite as happy to be tracked, but generally the owners and the dogs were quite happy to participate in the study. Here we looked at 4 lowland heath sites that were managed by either Surrey Wildlife Trust or Beebout. We used it doesn't really matter, but like GIS techniques and our sort of spatial mapping to essentially plot out those areas of disturbance. So where were the people walking, and then where were the dogs walking in relation to the people. These are the 4 sites that we looked at. So I'm at the moment somewhere probably under here. I can't really picture where Egham is. Somewhere over here. Chobham Common's our kind of local heathland. We also worked at Wildmoor Heath, Greenham Common and Snelsmore Common. And I haven't included the results for all of the different reserves because it's probably not really relevant to this kind of conversation. But these are the types of data that we were getting from the study that we did. So from memory, I think this is Wildmoor Heath. Yes, good, it is Wildmoor Heath. So here we recorded 162 dog owners and their walks basically around the reserves, and 185 dogs were GPS tracked as well. So we end up with these kinds of figures here. This is where we recorded the dogs and owners walking around the reserves. So essentially, if I'd have overlaid this with a map of the pathways, the people are pretty much sticking to the pathways, but you can see that the dogs are roaming around quite significantly off the path. And the red signifies the areas of the highest amount of disturbance. And in this site, this relates to where people are coming onto the reserve, essentially, because there's been research to show that, you know, the highest levels of disturbance will be found at the car parks, or, you know, within a couple of 100 meters of the car parks. And then this little figure here down at the bottom is looking at what would happen if dogs were kept on a 3-meter lead. So essentially, we took the tracks of the people and then we created a buffer zone around those of 3 meters. So it's kind of hard to see in these figures, but there is a reduction in the area disturbance if people were able to keep their dogs within 3 meters of them rather than the dogs roaming around significantly. What we found, because of course we didn't want to influence people's behaviour, so what we found in the study, because we didn't ask them to put the dogs on the lead or not, what we found is that the dogs were on average around 20 meters away from the dog owners, and that was an average across all sites. So you can see that, you know, obviously there was maximums of that. So some dogs were found significant distances away or moving away from their owners, and other dogs were, you know, keeping their paws on the path, basically. We also did a questionnaire as well, a fairly brief questionnaire with the dog owners, just to kind of get an idea of their behaviour. Most people were walking their dogs once a day, some people walking them twice a day, which is very typical, I guess. Most were walking off the lead, even when the signs were present. We did conduct this survey in this study at the end of the breeding season, so that the signs to keep your dog on the lead was still visible. The findings, the biggest finding really was that with dogs off the lead roaming freely, we were finding an increase of 21% in the reserve area disturbed compared to just where the dog owners were walking by themselves. And this has really increased in certain sites, I think, with really, really high footfall. And of course, this is going to erode the conservation value of these areas. So this is where, you know, we're really confronted, I think, with the need for recreational space and the need for spaces for nature. But you're obviously all converts and you'll understand these things. You know, we put in the paper, here's a QR code link to the paper if you wanted to have a look at it. But, you know, suitable alternative natural green spaces are, you know, one way of helping this. And I know that Nikki's doing a lot of work in this area and she'll talk to that later. If people did want to do a similar thing and they did want to kind of do GPS tracking of dogs and owners, the paper does include information about like the methodology and stuff and kind of how people can do that. In terms of next steps, I'm working with Surrey Wildlife Trust at the moment and Surrey County Council to do a further study using artificial nests and then positioning camera traps and observers near them to look at the disturbance around our artificial nests. That could be quite interesting. Hopefully I can share the findings of that with you at the end of the year. And then we're also doing a project which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, where we're looking at the effects of different types of signage on the behaviour of dog owners. And again, we don't have the results of that yet. We're doing that with the Thames Basin Heath Partnership with Nikki, who'll be presenting in a second. And what I would really like, I know you'll be asking me questions as well, but what I would really like to know is from those who are really working on the ground and practitioners and things, what kinds of research data would you benefit from having? Because obviously it'd be great to kind of know a little bit more about that.
That was great, Becky. Thank you so much. I've already scribbled down various different questions. It was really great to see that you got such good engagement with dog walkers who wanted to take part in the surveys and they wanted their dogs tracked. That's really, really nice to see.
Yeah, they were really keen, I think, to kind of engage with us and the students that were helping with the project. I think partly because we didn't make it really clear why we were doing it. You know, we were just saying we're really interested in kind of where you guys are going and stuff, and that was enough really to kind of get them to engage. That was great.
Amazing. Okay, let's hand over to Nikki then.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Nicola Buckland and I'm a communications officer for the Thames Basin Heaths Partnership, otherwise known as the SAM project, which stands for the Strategic Access Management and Monitoring Project. Just move that out of the way. So a little bit about me. Yeah, I've been with the project for 10 years and I get involved in all sorts of activities with it. So I'm out on the ground and I'm running the social media behind the scenes and our website. And I do have a dog of my own, so I am a dog owner. And I also set up our Heathland Hounds group back in 2007, which is our specifically targeted community dog owning group, where we wish to engage directly with our dog owners who are using the Thames Basin Heaths. So this is a map of the Thames Basin Heaths Special Protection Area. It covers 3 counties, so Berkshire, Hampshire and Surrey. Obviously, it's quite a wide area. In that total of Thames Basin Heaths we've got mapped out there, it's over 8,000 hectares. As you can see, it is quite fragmented. So the Thames Basin Heaths Special Protection Area was actually formed in 2005. Due to the presence of our 3 rare ground nesting birds that we have on these Thames Basin Heaths. So obviously the Dartford Warbler and the Woodlark we have resident all year round, and the Nightjar we have joining us from May till September. So this is our sort of general team infographic and our, well, nicely kind of summed up aims really. So We are hoping to engage visitors in Surrey, Hampshire and Berkshire and connect, respect and protect the Thames Basin Heaths. So we do that via engagement. So we have on the ground wardens, a team of wardens. We have an education officer who goes into schools to deliver educational sessions and out on the heaths. And we have monitoring in place to make sure that we are actually being effective. So our 3 core messages are to keep to the main paths during the nesting season of the 1st of March to the 15th of September. A large component is actually about being wildfire aware in light of increasing wildfires that we're facing on the Thames Basin Heaths. And the other third option is that we are promoting green space on your doorstep walks. So as Becky just briefly talked about, we have suitable alternative natural green space walks, which are dog friendly and less wildlife sensitive. We currently have over 80 of those that we promote. So this is a glance at the number of partners that we have. We currently actually have 26 local councils, land managers and nature conservation bodies, which is quite a challenge to have a partnership with that amount of partners and for everyone to have consistent messaging. And the Defence Infrastructure Organisation actually own about 60% of our Thames Basin Heath land in that landscape. So very briefly, this is what our SAM project looks like. We obviously have management positions, communications officer, education officer. We have 6 year-round wardens, and that's topped up by, actually we have 5 seasonal wardens that have just joined us for the bird nesting season. So our wardens are out 7 days a week across the day at hopefully peak dog walking times. So for when they aren't on the Thames Basin Heaths, we actually have our signs up across the SPA. This is our current sign design. And we have gone for the pause on pass please messaging. Now we use that hashtag across our social media too, and our partners also use that hashtag. We think it's very simple, very memorable, and it kind of reduces confusion with what is sticking to a path or letting your dog in the vegetation. You mentioned vegetation, and actually our visitors do get rather confused about what that means. Does that mean woodland? Does that mean the open heather and grass areas? So that sign was kind of designed to be very simplistic, low on text. It's obviously got a QR code link to our website. And yeah, simply sticking to pause on paths is the main messaging. So I briefly mentioned I set up the Heath and Hounds community group in 2007. So we have Joe and Mandy within our team who are regularly out on the Thames Basin Heaths in our pop-ups, as we call them, our gazebo pop-ups. Very nicely branded so that they're recognisable, very dog friendly. We're all dog owners, and we are there simply to talk directly to dog owners using those heaths and promote responsible dog walking. They also run an average of 2 waggy walks, as we call them, a month. So these are on the sangs. Obviously, you know, trying to get around 3 counties worth of sangs is some feat, but they do manage it, and we have managed to promote sangs very effectively via these walks. So that is just what our sang booklet looks like. It's a free resource that we give out when we're wardening and when we're running pop-up events or any other events. It's great. People keep it in their car when they're travelling around and they're visiting family or friends. They may just have a look in there and say, you know, where's the nearest one to that part of Surrey? And there's a really great deal of choice for where to walk, which is less wildlife sensitive. And Heath and Hounds have their own dog code, good dog guide. So again, it's very similar to what other conservation organisations share in terms of keeping to main paths, preventing your dog from chasing wildlife, and livestock, bagging and binning poo. But also we put a training aspect in there to try and encourage people to really connect with their dog on walks. So, you know, by playing games or testing recall or throwing, you know, the ball down the path, not into the vegetation. That's all very simple messaging to reinforce the pause on paths, please. So obviously we have to monitor our activities to see if we're being effective. We do this in a number of ways. So we have a team of qualified bird surveyors who run surveys throughout the year, collecting the bird data so that we can monitor long-term trends and see if our numbers of nightjar, Dartford warbler and woodlark are increasing or decreasing. Obviously, that will be part related to recreational disturbance, but also there'll be factors such as wildfire, kind of winter weather affecting bird survival and other variables like that. We also run regular SPA visitor surveys where we look at the visitor habits of people coming to visit the Thames Basin Heaths, and likewise we run visitor surveys on the sangs. We need to know that those sangs are working and appealing to visitors as an alternative to the Thames Basin Heaths. We've also got people counters, so we are measuring the footfall at randomised points on the Thames Basin Heaths, and the wardening team complete daily logs. So when they're out wardening on a heath, they will collect the number of people they've already spoken to, number of dogs, and other important data like that. And there we go. That's a very a very rushed overview of the project.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I love the idea of waggy walks. That sounds really, really fun. And it's great that you talk so much, Sarah, about engaging so positively with the public and with dog walkers. And I know that that's something we're going to dig into a lot during the panel discussion. So thank you very much for that. Last but not least, we've got Leigh.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Leigh Weston from Hilltop Farm in Malham in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, where I farm with my partner, Neil Heseltine. Lots of you may know Malham, and you can see Malham Cove on the left-hand side of the slide there. Malham is extremely beautiful. It's very famous for its geology and its limestone landscape. And it's a massive privilege to live somewhere like Malham, where everybody else wants to visit. It's fair to say Malham is a honeypot village. I checked the stats this week when I was prepping for this, and there's over 100,000 visitors every year. And just on Saturday alone this week, there was 600 cars parked in the village. The village has residents, there's about 150 of us, so that gives you an idea of the scale of the people coming into the landscape. I'm originally from Newcastle. I have a very urban background. I grew up just outside of Newcastle in a really industrial town, and I've lived here for 20 years, so I see it very much from both sides. I see the benefit of getting out into beautiful open spaces, but also the conflict, and do worry often about the welfare of wildlife and also the welfare of our grazing livestock. So just a little bit about our farm. We're an upland farm. Agriculturally, it's deemed as disadvantaged, and that means it's very rough grazing. It's not productive land, but our native breed cattle do very well on it, and it's absolutely brilliant for ground nesting birds. Through environmental stewardship, we went from a very intensive sheep grazing system to very much a nature-led system, where we now put nature at the heart of all the farm decision making. We have belted and rigget Galloway cattle, and we use them to create and manage habitats. Conservation grazing for flowers, sedges, grasses, making sure they can survive and not be outcompeted by grass. But also this creates the right conditions for ground nesting birds. Biodiverse grassland means diverse food sources for waders, so lots of invertebrates, insects, spiders, all the things that chicks like to eat. And cattle grazing gives you a varied grassland, so long tusky areas to give protection from predation, but also short areas for chicks to be able to get out and feed. So yeah, as Ellen said before, we're really, really lucky to have breeding curlews and other waders on our land. We have curlews on at least 3 sites in Malhamdale, 2 upland sites where you can see in the background there the cows, and then also 1 lowland meadow area where we have very late putting dates to allow the birds plenty of space and time to get away. I saw Mary Colwell speak a few years ago, and like lots of people who see Mary Colwell speak, I was inspired to try and help curlews, and with other local people started the Malham Curlew project. And you can see our volunteers in the photo there on a training day, and we now survey our birds and also lapwing, oystercatcher and redshank. And it's great to know where our curlews and waders are, what they're doing, and their potential for breeding success. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that recreational disturbance happens and also farming disturbance. And it's actually really, really distressing when things go wrong. We have working sheepdogs and we've had dogs, pet dogs, and I know how much people love them, but it can be highly distressing when it goes wrong. Disturbance can be anything from dogs being off leads away from their owners, as other speakers have alluded to, or just the presence of dogs and people in the landscape. Our farm has footpaths just through almost every field, and all of our upland areas are all open access. We massively welcome this. We recognise the heritage that the UK has about people moving around on foot, and that has been part of farming life for Neil and his family for a long, long time, and they're used to people being in the landscape. But I think there's no doubt that disturbance has increased with visitor numbers. I've had hens killed by dogs, we've had sheep injured, calves being chased, and it can be really, really challenging. You can see the Curlew Action signs out there and on the footpath, and we use these to try and influence behaviour, and I think people stop to look at them. And this particular sign is on the footpath, actually on the right-hand side, which is probably the busiest footpath in the whole of the national park, and it goes through our land. I think we have varying success with this. It's a real challenge to change behaviour, but you can see here that all of the people walking through the cows have their dogs on leads and are all showing huge amounts of responsibility. So just a little bit about engagement for us. We engage a lot through social media. We're on Instagram, which can often turn a bit binary with questions about dogs and dogs on leads and how people should conduct themselves with dogs. This particular slide relates to an event we were involved in with Friends of the Dales, a local charity. We had lots of really, really interesting and productive conversations about dogs and dog walking, and people were really, really open, respectful about those conversations, but some did feel challenged by it. I think as farmers, we feel like the majority of people do the right thing. Otherwise, the problem would be loads worse than it is, given the visitor numbers we have. But I think it's really important to have this discussion and unpick the psychology around recreational behaviour and just ask ourselves how we can raise the profile of wildlife with anyone who uses the landscape, whether that's residents or visitors, and also the ways in which we can motivate people to protect animals and birds when they're enjoying the landscape and also grazing animals. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Leigh. I think you are absolutely right to bring up the kind of the psychology of recreational behavior and how can we engage with people in a way that kind of allows them to be heard. And I really like that you talked about the event that you did with Friends of the Dales. I remember hearing about it, and it's a great event. And what you said at the start about how beautiful the farm is, I've been very lucky and visited Leigh up on the farm a few times, and I can confirm it is absolutely beautiful. Right, okay, so we are now going to have a little bit of a discussion with the panelists. So Becky, I'm going to start with you. I would really like to talk a bit more about your research. Your research was obviously specifically looking at lowland heaths. How transferable is what you found to other habitats?
Yep, great question. So I don't know directly because we haven't done that, but I suspect it's quite transferable. I suspect that the behaviours are very, very similar in terms of the way that people behave in terms of letting their dogs off the lead. I mean, perhaps just as much, I think, within woodlands, I suspect, than in heathland environments. There hasn't been any other tracking study that's been done in the same way as the one that we carried out, but there have been other bits of research done within woodland environments too, and I think it was not in this country, I think in Europe, but I think the findings were quite similar, like similar levels of disturbance, similar levels of dogs moving away from the owners and running through the vegetation. And I think it was a really important point earlier about members of the public not really understanding about what we mean by vegetation. So it's so important, I think, to think about the wording and language that we use around that, so that we're making sure that people do completely understand about what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned in your presentation that you conducted this study at the end of the breeding season. What does that mean for kind of the winter months, not during the breeding season? Would it be okay for somebody to let their dog off the lead during the winter months?
Yeah, that's very difficult to answer. So it's difficult to answer because I think the worst period to have dog disturbance is obviously during the breeding season. The birds are going to be highly agitated during the period when they're having dogs running through and past their nests. Obviously, it's going to be stopping them from feeding and from undertaking activities where they're looking after their young or brooding the eggs. Outside of the breeding season, it's still not going to be great, though, in terms of disturbance that's caused to those caused to the birds, when they are trying to find food during the winter months. So, I think it isn't great either way, but obviously it's much worse during the breeding season, just because of the disturbance and the fact that it's affecting, the population increases that particular year. And obviously we can't really get away from the fact that although most dogs wouldn't do this, there are dogs with high predatory drives as well. So there's going to be instances, and it's recorded in other parts of the world, where dogs are eating birds and they're eating eggs and like directly affecting them, not just indirectly from affecting their behaviour.
Yeah, I know that this is something that the Curlew Action team has been talking about, and I think they might have already done it, creating wintering bird signs, because lots of dogs on the beach during the winter season and wading birds. It must be very fun for a dog to chase through it, but that is a problem as well. So there is a bit of a balance here. How, obviously, a lot of us, we all like the outdoors. A lot of us here are dog owners and we all love our dogs. How can we reduce disturbance of wildlife while also creating the space for people and their dogs to enjoy the outdoors? And I'm going to ask all three of you to respond to that one, but we'll start with Nicola.
Admittedly, we are really, really lucky in the Thames Basin area to have these 80+ sangs as alternatives. Not every mitigation project in a different geographical area has that amount of green space to promote as a kind of healthy alternative. Although we're finding actually more and more that skylark are nesting on sangs. So that's posing, quite a challenge to say, go and use this sang, but actually there are ground nesting birds on there too. So that's something we're closely monitoring. But they are popular alternatives, and they do work well as part of our mitigation project. But I think, going sort of back to Heath and Hounds, we're an educational project, and it really is just this feeling of inclusivity for dog owners. If you have a kind of wildlife organisation versus dog owning scenario, and you don't have those conversations, it just amplifies the problems. So, the more we can close that gap and keep talking, and actually kind of really describing what disturbance looks like, because a lot of dog owners will tell us that, my dog has just run in there in the open heather there, but they didn't come back with a bird in their mouth, or I didn't see a bird flush out. So the actual kind of understanding of the concept of disturbance is sometimes not there. So explaining that, they could just be, pushed off a nest, a woodlark particularly might just actually run along the ground and not flush up, that you can be causing disturbance without knowing it. It's not like a coastal bird where you can see them, a whole flock of birds fly up. And really for within our project, it's actually about providing support. So some dog owners want to do the right thing, but they just don't necessarily know how. So talking about those kind of tips and training activities that people can do on the heath, even throwing a ball down a path rather than into the heather, it's all kind of building on that concept of how you can make your visit the the most wildlife friendly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it should not be conservation versus dog owners. I think we've all kind of seen those debates on social media where it gets very kind of black and white and nobody's engaging positively. So yeah, that was a really good point. Leigh.
Yeah, I just, when I read your question, it's hugely complicated, and I actually find it very, very difficult to work it out. In the Yorkshire Dales National Park, parts of it like Malham are very, very busy, with huge numbers of dogs. Often other places aren't so much. And just having a chat with Anne Shadrick, who is the director of Friends of the Dales, who I mentioned in my presentation, she was in Malham on Saturday, and Malham was so busy at the weekend, and she said it was really interesting that it was so busy, and actually there was more dogs on leads than usual because it was so busy. And I think some of the reason behind that is that people want to protect their own dogs from maybe interaction with other dogs, so they want to keep the dogs under closer control because it's busier. And the circular walk that goes through our farmland is a hugely busy footpath, and I just wonder whether I need to look at Malham and see actually how much is happening here and what the disturbance level is when we are so busy. I don't think I have any answers about it really. I just try when I'm out on the farm and out on the footpath, out surveying curlews, that I keep talking to people and keep having the conversation. And I think the most positive experiences for me are when I actually physically speak to people, because often they ask me what I'm doing and it's just an open conversation. And sometimes if the dog is off the lead, I'll maybe just say, oh, it's actually really helpful if the dog is maybe kept to the path or on the lead, just because this is what we're doing. And actually not many people are aggressive or mean about that. So I wish I could spend all day talking to people sometimes, because I think it's hugely helpful, and maybe people get more from that than they do a sign.
Yeah, definitely. I know we're going to talk a bit more about that later, so I won't ask any more questions about that yet. But Becky, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. I think the work that Leigh and Nikki are doing, I think, communicating with people and talking to people and explaining things, I think is just so important, because as much as like we're doing this project at the moment that Nikki's involved in, where we're looking at signage and how to communicate with people, I don't think anything is better than actually having those direct conversations with people, which we did in our study as well. But it was when we were obviously taking off the GPS tags, we were then explaining to people why we were doing it. But there's so much misconception from people because they're looking at these open, for lowland heath specifically, and I guess probably up in the Dales as well, these open environments, because they're not seeing these like masses of birds and not really understanding about how important these habitats are. And also, from the research that I was doing when we were looking at cat predation, animals don't understand the difference between a pet cat, a pet dog, a fox. They don't understand that some things are predators and some things are not. So there's something called the indirect fear effect, where essentially a prey animal, so any of these birds, is going to have a kind of negative like bodily response to a predator being nearby, usually just like a stress response, like cortisol being released in their body, and that can have really bad effects on them longer term and their kind of ability to reproduce, which we're not seeing like routinely. We're obviously seeing these massive population declines, but it's just so much more complex than that. In an ideal world, it'd be lovely, and it's not practical, but to be able to say, we know the birds are using this part, let's find a way of kind of screening them, or or trying to keep people away from that. But the reality of that is just not possible. Leigh's facing that with footpaths and things, and you obviously want visitors, and we want people to be appreciating these environments as well. But it's going to become more of a problem. I saw a comment in the chat earlier about dog numbers and whether they're kind of tapering off, or we're seeing increases or decreases. Well, I think it's not just about the dog numbers, but it's about where we're choosing to develop, where we're choosing to have higher numbers of people. And obviously there's tourism effects as well that Leigh's seeing. But Nikki's faced in the Thames Basin Heath areas with huge numbers of people, high densities of housing, high densities of people, and increases in that, because we're on the outskirts of London. It's just only really going to increase. So it's how do we manage all these things at the same time? It's really hard.
Yeah, as with any kind of conservation topic or question, there's never a kind of simple, straightforward answer. All three of you have talked about engaging positively with people. I think you guys have talked about it's great having those face-to-face conversations. It's not always face-to-face though. Actually, most of the time it's not going to be. Leigh, I know you are really active on social media. If anyone's not following Leigh on Instagram, go and follow Hilltop Farm Girl because her content is great. Lots of great cow videos. How can we engage with the public positively to talk about these issues if we can't always talk to them face to face?
Thank you for the shout out. I think positivity is always good, and I think making a positive case for wildlife and engaging people in wildlife and curlews for me have been something that people have hugely engaged in over the years, in terms of the content I put out. And I think once people love a curlew or any other creature, they are more willing to be understanding about what you're asking of them. So I think don't do this doesn't work. I think it's about positive engagement and positive experiences, and showing an interest in people's point of view on this. That's probably the best thing I could say. I think our Malhamdale Curlew project is looking at creating our own signs this year, maybe telling people about what we're doing to help curlews and waders. And also how, and then those signs will tell people, like, you know, we've seen how they can actively engage to help us to help curlews. And I think when I talk about curlews, I'm talking about all wildlife really, because we have lots and lots of wildlife on the farm, hares, owls, all sorts of things. And then the other thing I think about social media is, like, somewhere like Malham has a huge percentage of 18 to 30 age group visiting, and a lot of them are huge fitness influencers, and they're creating amazing, talented content. And I'd love to engage and have a conversation with some of them about what lives here and about the landscape and their experience of the landscape when they come here, and whether they feel aware of all the other things that happen here outside of fitness and lifestyle and beauty, basically. But I think positivity, whatever format you're going for, positivity has to be the way forward.
Love the idea of engaging with these kind of young fitness influencers, and I think that would be really great to see some like collaborative posts between like a conservation farming account and a fitness account. I think that'd be a great way to reach new audiences. So yeah, fully supportive of that, Leigh, if you want to do that. Nicola.
Yeah, so talking about positivity, we actually run a campaign during the breeding season called Heath and Heroes. So when our wardens are actually out on the heaths, if they meet a dog owner with a dog that is exhibiting a positive behaviour, as in they have the dog on the lead, or they're playing games with their dog on a path, or they just have an awareness of ground nesting birds, we will take a photo of the dog, and then we have it all nicely formatted under the lovely Heath and Heroes kind of border and everything. And then we will celebrate that positive behaviour on social media. So we are trying to maybe aim for at least one post a week for Heath and Heroes, where it will be here, you know, here is Ralph, he walks at Horsell Common, and his owner keeps him on a lead during the breeding season. So we're trying to normalise that, you know, that positive behaviour, and say it is possible and people are doing it, which I think, you know, helps dog owners feel included in our social media content, and have a bit of a voice. But also for some of our content, we will have wildlife enthusiasts who feel obviously very passionately about disturbance, kind of being quite negative and saying, well, that's great that you're putting up the ground nesting bird signs at this time of year, but nobody, you know, looks at them or adheres to that guidance, which is not helping with alienating the dog owning community. So to balance that out with some positive social media content, I think is really, really worthwhile. doing. It's well received. But yes, I mean, we just keep those lines of communication with dog owners open. And as I say, I keep sort of pitching for Heath and Hounds, but I think if every conservation organisation could have their own dog owning group, it's the way forward. I mean, ours is based on the Dorset Dogs model, but you know, we have a wider sort of partnership of our own with other mitigation projects, and there's Devon Loves Dogs, there's the New Forest National Park Authority have their dog community group. So I think we're all on board with that messaging, that is the kind of way we have to move in the future, is to have those sort of messaging streams to keep the communication open with dog owners.
Yeah, definitely keeping those lines of communications open is really important, and making people feel like they're part of the solution, not part of the problem, because otherwise it's just going to alienate them and they're not going to want to talk to you. So yeah, some really, really great points. Becky, I have a slightly different question for you. In an area like Malham, where they have 100,000 visitors a year, there is going to be lots of disturbance, even if most people are keeping dogs on leads. Can wildlife habituate to disturbance?
Yes, so some wildlife can habituate. So if you think about the idea of like urbanization, you know, in the process of that, people start building things and more people are around. Like some species can be quite tolerant of people. So robins, for instance, becoming our little gardener's friend, and blackbirds, you know, flying among us and stuff. There's definitely some species that will habituate to people, and some, in fact, that just rely upon people, pigeons and things like that and whatever. But there are species that won't really habituate to people. So when scientists study things called flight initiation distances, so the distance that you can approach a particular animal before it will fly away or run away or whatever, or become agitated, we're definitely seeing like massive differences between different types of taxonomic groups, like between mammals and birds and things like that, but also between different species. So that there's just some species that just don't tolerate high levels of disturbance, and I suspect that that's why some of these birds that we're talking about are so rare. You know, it's really that they're just not able to tolerate the numbers of people. I can't even imagine what it must be like having hundreds of thousands of people descending upon your farm. But you know, that's a huge amount of disturbance, and if every interaction that those birds are having, it's eliciting that stress response, it's going to be affecting them. Over time, you know, birds could evolve, you know, to sort of handle this kind of thing, but we're just not giving them enough time to kind of evolve those changes and stuff. And these birds are just very vulnerable. They're ground nesting. I mean, that's another reason why they're so at threat. And there's lots of other interchanging things as well. You know, obviously our behavior is increasing other predator numbers and things like that. So it's a really, really tough time for them. And when I ever communicate with any dog owners, you know, if I'm kind of coming across people and I'm doing research and stuff, I just try and, when I'm talking about it with them, put it in the perspective of there's so many threats to species at the moment, so many threats to birds, so many threats to habitats. There's so little kind of you know, lowland heath specifically, if we're talking about that, and they're just adding, they're just a tiny piece to it, but they're adding to it, you know, with nightjars and stuff, migration, and you know, there's so many challenges for these birds, and we're making it really, really hard when they do arrive here and they do start breeding.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that they're up against. Nicola, coming back to you, we've obviously talked a lot about positive engagement and how important that is. What about when that doesn't work? We heard from Becky's presentation at the start that a lot of people are ignoring the signs asking them to keep dogs on leads. Are there any repercussions for having dogs off leads when they've been asked not to?
Yeah, so actually of our number of heaths, we have, I think, only 2 which actually specify dogs on leads guidance, and one is because of grazing ponies present. And we've actually found that the majority of dog walkers there, across the bottom where the ponies are, they do keep their dogs on leads, and actually they're very good at kind of putting peer pressure on fellow dog owners if they see them off lead. But there is a small core group that just will refuse to do that. And the reality is that they know that there are no powers of enforcement to make them do so, regardless of, you know, site staff being out there on site and our wardening team being out there. We can only appeal to their conscience. So I think there's the danger of them kind of setting that new norm, in that, you know, you might have new visitors that come along and say, well, I've just seen that sign saying dogs on leads, but I've just passed 3 people with dogs off leads. So if they're not doing it, then why should I? You know, that's the problem. And as a wardening team, we're there to kind of try and get them on the straight and narrow. But yes, we have certainly seen, well, I wouldn't say attacks, but we have seen dogs chasing the grazing ponies there, and grazing cattle on other sites. So that is definitely a real thing. Yeah. But it's hard to, you know, sort of throw legislation at people when there's nobody. You know, we could talk about open access land and dogs being on leads from March to July, but people will simply say, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, I don't think in reality either that we have ever heard of a case of prosecution where somebody has been prosecuted for disturbing a bird nest. So yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it kind of feeds into a wider kind of cultural thing about how do we connect with, engage with wildlife, and how do people view it. Leigh, what about any kind of repercussions for disturbing livestock?
Yeah, there certainly are repercussions, and twofold. There are legal repercussions, but like Nicola said, there aren't a huge amount of prosecutions, but when there are, they're usually quite interesting results. So legally, there is the Dog Protection of Livestock Act 1953, and basically owners can be prosecuted for dogs attacking, chasing, injuring, sheep aborting due to being chased, or suffering generically, which they do. But it doesn't happen that often. And the reason that being is, if a dog's off a lead way ahead of the owner and the owner exits the field without raising the alarm, and you're not there to see, you're not with your sheep 100% of the time, you may get there and it's happened and nobody knows who's done it. I do occasionally get phone calls to say there's a dog chasing your sheep down in the meadows, and they've just walked out and let them do it, and are now sat in the cafe if you want to go and speak to them. So you know that it does happen, and it does get witnessed sometimes, and I do, if I can, go and speak to people and have just a really try and have a low-key conversation about that. Farmers can take reasonable action to shoot dogs. Again, that is quite rare. It doesn't happen very often. But there was, not in Malham, but just further down the valley, there was a local case where a farmer shot a dog for worrying sheep. The sheep were injured. He lost quite a few sheep. The actual owner of the dog took him to court for shooting the dog, and he won it. The court found in his favour, and that he had been completely reasonable in his actions. So, but I think the other point about it is, I think there's just a binary conversation about, if you are a farmer and you have animals, that it doesn't really matter about them. And I've had this said to me on Instagram, well, it doesn't really matter because you're going to kill them anyway. And I find that a really shocking viewpoint, that you know, a lot of our breeding sheep won't be killed for meat. That's not what they're there for. And we treat them extremely kindly and have a high natural welfare where they exhibit natural behavior. And the thought that people think it's okay to subject them to injurious situations, I find really upsetting. And when it happens, the loss of control you feel and the dog owner feels because you cannot, or often you cannot stop that dog from what it's doing. You're not quick enough to get it. It won't come to recall, and it can just terrorize things so quickly, and it can turn awful really, really quickly. So there's a bit of an emotional charge to it, but then also a legal charge to it as well, I'd say. It's something I try and avoid at all costs.
Yeah, that does sound really, really difficult. But kudos to you for going and having conversations with people in the cafe and doing it kind of positively. I think that's a really good way of going forward. Okay, so we've talked a lot about dogs, obviously, this evening. But Becky, there are lots of different ways that we could be disturbing wildlife. Obviously, we could just be walking, we could be mountain biking, we could be running. Has there been any research into the different ways that we could be impacting wildlife?
Yes, shockingly, there's been more about mountain bikes and walking and running and things like that than there has been about dogs, actually, I suspect, because it's a bit more difficult to do it with dogs. But yes, yeah, there's quite a few papers published to talk about the disturbance that's caused to birds and other mammals and things like that through just any kind of recreational use. So walking will elicit the same type of response, but it's not as bad. Jogging is worse, I guess, because the animal perceives the jogger to be moving at speed and to perceive it as being more of a threat potentially. But also it very much depends on the direction of travel and where you happen to kind of encounter that species, if that sort of makes sense. And mountain biking is worse again, probably because of the speed at which those bikes are going and the way that the birds perceive that as a particular threat. So there's a lot of research actually published about flight initiation distances in birds and different modes of transport and things.
That's really interesting. I'd not really thought about that kind of stuff and that, the level of impact that might have on birds before this webinar. What about, you said that there's not been that much research into dogs. Has there been any research into different species of dogs? Do different species have a different impact?
Yes, so we looked at that a little bit in the study, but we didn't quite have the diversity of different dogs. We didn't look at it by species, but we looked at it by size. So we kind of allocated them out into large dogs, medium dogs, low dogs, when we're just looking at their movements and things. I suspect that from a bird's point of view, they probably don't. I don't know. There hasn't been. I'm not aware of any research where it's looked at dog breeds and the effect on the birds, but each dog, dogs are obviously bred for different behaviors, aren't they? So you have ones that have more of that prey hunting drive. So I'm thinking of spaniels, I guess. I'm not massively up on what all the dog breeds do, but I suspect that there are dogs that behave slightly differently during walks and things. They're going to be off and they're going to be smelling in the vegetation and moving around a lot more than other dog breeds. I suspect that maybe some of the larger dog breeds, in fact, probably. But again, I think it's very, very breed specific, and rather than size, which is what we looked at, which is why we didn't publish that in the paper. I think it's very breed specific as to what that dog breed has been bred for. And I'm aware, obviously, that most dogs now are not working dogs, but they're still going to have that kind of inherent, drive of what it is that they've been bred to do.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to see. And also, I think I've just made a biological faux pas calling them species rather than breeds. They all different species. I don't really know. I don't know.
Shockingly not when you see a Chihuahua could breed with a Great Dane. Like I'm not sure physically it can, but they but biologically yes, they are the same species.
Every day's a school day. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what we can do as conservationists and land managers and scientists, and how we can engage with the public, and kind of through that we've talked about what we would like to see the public doing in terms of behavior shifts. But just before we open up for the Q&A, I wanted to ask whether you have any final bits of advice on how we can be responsible dog owners or responsible walkers or responsible mountain bikers, however we're using the landscape. Nicola, should we start with you?
Yeah, so I think, sometimes it's very easy to focus on our aims and talk mostly about wildlife disturbance, but actually, with like almost 80% of our visitors bringing a dog with them, we try to focus a bit more on dog safety messaging. So, you know, if somebody is out on a heath walking their dog and they have no interest in wildlife at all, how are you going to get that hook in? Which is to talk about dog safety. So, I mean, I follow a lot of local Facebook groups, dog groups, and it's every day dogs going missing, you know, dogs running off. Have you seen my dog? So a big part of that is, why would you not want to have a dog with recall, you know, because it's putting your dog in danger. So there is that emphasis on, you know, you putting your dog on a lead at times, passing an area of cattle or passing horse riders, is going to benefit you and your dog. So I think we need to try and move away from this kind of outlook of, you know, I pull up at a car park, it's a lovely, great open heath, but actually it doesn't have any fencing boundaries, and letting my dog off a lead and hoping for the best. Because, you know, I have talked to dog owners who have said, my dog runs off for 20 minutes, it will usually come back, and nothing bad has happened so far, but yes, I guess that one day something bad could happen. So it's an interesting insight that people are willing to take that risk. But actually, sometimes when you just have that conversation about dog safety, you know, you're in a 300 hectare open heath here. Do you really want to lose your dog out here? You know, there's a lot of dangers. So I think it's just a nice way of turning around the messaging, you know, to remind people of what they're going to get out of doing the right thing, rather than necessarily for the wildlife.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Leigh, anything you want to add?
From a farmland perspective, I'd just maybe say to expect the unexpected. When you enter a field, you may not actually think there's any cows or sheep in that field. But like up here in the hills, land's undulating, you can't necessarily see everything. Things can be hidden. And by the time you get to those animals, if they're there, it could be too late in terms of you being able to stop your dog. And just like Nicola said, maybe your dog will be in danger if it's so far ahead of you. And cows in particular, sheep are very much a flight, they'll just run. Cows are a bit more, and like our cows, I mentioned that pretty much our entire farm has footpaths through it. So our cows are used to mountain bikers, walkers, runners. They just see everything recreationally here. But they still are, you know, semi-domesticated animals that are used to live in a semi-wild life. And that for dog and person safety needs to be respected. And a lot of the reason why we take those pictures that are included there is to keep checking in with our cows to see how they behave around people and dogs and what their reaction is to that situation. So I think it's expect the unexpected. Even on open access land, there's usually a well-trod path where people are coming through, and if you can stick to that path, then absolutely brilliant. That's probably the best thing to do. And in terms of wildlife, I think they design themselves to be camouflaged and not to be seen, to protect themselves. And I think just expect them to be there, behave as if they are there, and try and be as discreet as possible and protect them. Just protect them as much as you can.
Yeah, I think just because you can't necessarily see the ground nesting birds does not mean they're not there. I mean, curlew nests are famously exceptionally difficult to find, even if you're a few meters away from them. Becky, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I think whenever I'm thinking about these sorts of issues, I'm always trying to remind myself of how kind of disconnected from nature people are, and how actually these types of walks and engaging, you know, and dog walking, a lot of these people wouldn't go out for walks otherwise, and they certainly wouldn't be driving off to these lovely habitats and stuff. So, and linking back to the conversation earlier about positivity in terms of messaging, I think that's so important. There's a lot of research looking out there about how do you change behaviours of people, and it isn't through shame, and it isn't through making people feel really bad about their behaviours. I think it's doing what Nicola and Leigh are doing, you know, in terms of diverting people away, or, you know, highlighting the opportunities there and the good behavior that they can do while they're there. But I really like the idea of, you know, alternative sites. When we did questionnaire surveys with the dog owners, the biggest reason for letting their dogs off the lead and off the path and things was because they felt like it was that natural behavior for the dog. And I don't think you can change that, but I think explaining to people that they're walking through really rare, sensitive habitats is really important. And then saying, you know, there's all these alternative spaces that you can go where your dog can go absolutely wild if you want it to, and be off in the vegetation, I think is really important. So just acknowledging that people really need that contact with nature, but they can still kind of have it in these alternative spaces as well. They don't have to do it in these rarer, more sensitive locations.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely need to give people space to enjoy the outdoors. That's a really important part of connecting with nature. Okay, thank you so much, panelists, for that discussion. That was really interesting. Flo, I can't actually see the chat, but I know I can see that you've put in lots of the questions into a document. But if there are any more coming through, if you could just, yeah, keep whacking them in, that would be great. First question, which I reckon is probably for Becky. Becky, have you ever used Strava, or is anyone using data from Strava on like tracking people's movements? And obviously there might be some issues there with like data privacy, but how that might be impacting wildlife.
I've not seen it being used by anybody. I'm kind of aware, and there's another app as well. I think it's called something like Biscuit, which where dog owners can log in and they get kind of points and then maybe vouchers for like logging their dog walks and stuff. So I'm aware that there are apps available where people can kind of track where they're going. I mean, I personally feel really uncomfortable with the idea of, you know, doing something like that. I mean, I wouldn't even have Alexa devices in my house because they're like recording all your conversations. Not that I have interesting conversations, but, you know, I think there's some discussions to be had around, you know, I mean, I think those data could be used as an interesting source to see like where people are going, but there's some bias in terms of like who those people are that are downloading them. I suspect that, not to stereotype, but perhaps older populations are less likely to be downloading those types of apps and stuff. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see about what are the incentives for people to kind of download it and share their data in those ways.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. A lot of my friends use Strava actually, and I'm sure actually that a lot of people who use Strava would be interested to see, you know, what's the wider pattern, and is that having an impact on stuff. Okay, so a question from Kyle, and I think this could be any of you from possibly different angles. Kyle says, I wonder how the presence of dogs walking on leads affects the mammalian predator behavior, or any kind of predator behavior. Has there been any research onto the how dogs interact with predators of maybe ground nesting birds?
Yes, there has. I think there's, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think there has been a little bit of research. So I think it's really variable. So I think in some cases, I think it was found that dogs can deter nest predators, mostly corvids, I think, like from the birds. But I think there was something, I think it was picked up in the chat as well, but I haven't been able to keep up with it. But something, I'm sure there was some stuff about foxes and how actually it's not increasing numbers, but it is definitely not diverting fox behavior. And actually foxes are obviously mostly coming out at different times, so there's that kind of temporal difference between when they're using stuff. I'm not sure about other mammalian predators like you know, weasels and stoats and things like that. I suspect that high numbers of dogs, again, because they're more nocturnal, I suspect they probably wouldn't really be having too much of an effect. But I don't think there's a huge amount of research done in that area.
That would be really interesting. Megan, I don't know if you just flip some settings, or because I said it, now Teams has decided it's going to work, but I can now see the chat. Megan has a question for Leigh, and actually I reckon Nicola could probably talk to this as well. How useful are the signs?
I think they are useful. I think the Curlew Action signs are useful because I think they're illustrative and I think they're non-confrontational. I really like them. and we used them a lot last year. We've used them for the last few years actually, but I used more last year. And Becky mentioned about the 100,000 visitors coming to Malham and coming through the farmland. And a lot of those visitors stay to one particular path, which is a very famous circular walk, and our land is through it. We do have other sites that still are open access or have a designated footpath, but they're a bit more off the beaten track, and they will attract more serious walkers, hill walkers, mountain bikers. And I think people find them interesting. I think they arouse curiosity, which is always a good thing. So yeah, I really like them. I really like them, and I think I do see many people keeping dogs on leads. I really do. So yeah, I can only believe that they're a positive influence on people's behaviour.
Nicola?
Yeah, I think that ours have proven effective over the years. We're certainly seeing an increase in the number of visitors who will tell us about ground nesting birds before we've even introduced ourselves. So that level of awareness has certainly gone up. For us, it's also about having consistent signage across Thames Basin Heaths across 3 counties in such a massive landscape. So ours are about saying, you know, you are entering a special protection area heath, and you will see this same messaging on this heath in Berkshire as you will see on this heath in Surrey. And I think this is probably happening across a lot of different nature reserves. We do have a high level of sign vandalism. So we don't ever catch anybody, you know, actually at the time to ask them why they're pulling them down and throwing them in the gorse. I think that we have had a bit of feedback which says that perhaps we are putting too much signage up, and people think that it's kind of, you know, like aesthetically, you know, not pleasing to see so many. But I do equally feel like it's just not liking being told what to do. And perhaps our signage is very specific to dog owners, rather than mentioning, you know, cyclists, horse riders and other user groups. So it, you know, it may well be a defensive response in terms of those signs specifically for dog owners, but on the whole it's pretty positive.
Can I just jump in there? Yeah, I'd forgotten that actually. Yeah, we've had some sign vandalism as well, where they've been taken out and chucked over dry stone walls, and you find them in a field. And I don't know who's doing that, but it could be, as Nicola mentioned before, the minority that you're probably never going to reach that are going to do something regardless, and just don't like being asked to do something. And I kind of can't, as much as I want to engage with that, I'm not sure that's my target audience here in Malham. I concentrate on the people who I feel I can have a narrative with, a mutual narrative.
Nicola, you mentioned that you work to keep the signage consistent across your sites. I mean, you've got a really big area that you're working across. And then Leigh, you mentioned that you might be making some area specific ones. I wonder, has anyone looked into the impacts of having something that is very, very local, that says, you know, in Malham we've got X number of curlew pairs or whatever it is, and whether that would make a difference to people's psychology, or whether it's better to have that consistent messaging so that people are familiar with it? What do you guys think?
I don't know much about it, but we've been up to the Bolton Castle estate up in the Northern Dales, up in Wensleydale, and up there they have a big curlew project there. It's all managed moorland, grouse moor, but they have estate signs that basically say we are part of a monitoring programme for ground nesting birds. We work with BTO, we work with the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority. We would really appreciate, I've actually got a copy of it on my presentation that I didn't use, but we would really appreciate your help looking after these birds, kind of thing. And I'd love to know from the estate, I'll have to ask them how they feel that works for them. I would be really interested to know.
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons maybe to having consistent kind of signage at a landscape, and then maybe having something more tailored to individual sites, but I think for a large number of visitors that we speak to, they are likely using more than one of our local Thames Basin heaths. So, you know, in Surrey, they may walk at Chobham Common and Lightwater Common, Country Park and Horsell Common, because geographically they aren't that, you know, distance from each other. So for that reason, I think it is good to have that consistency, that they know when they're going from that heath on that day of the week to the other one, that it's the same, you know, the guidance is the same. We just have to be quite aware of kind of giving out bird data, so we don't tend to share kind of numbers or any kind of location information on signage. But perhaps that would have more of a community feel to it. So it's definitely something useful to think about for the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. I imagine there's probably pros and cons to both of them. Okay, a question probably for Becky. Becky, you mentioned in your presentation how many dogs there are in the UK, and there's a lot, and cats. Is dog disturbance still increasing? Has dog ownership flattened off, or are we predicted to have even more dogs and therefore potentially more disturbance? What do you think?
I think there was a prediction during COVID that we were going to see massive increases in dog ownership and cat ownership and things like that. And I don't think that really materialised. I think any studies that I've seen about dog ownership in the UK, it has remained stable for quite a long period of time. So we're looking at around the sort of 11 to 12 million dogs, and that's not massively increasing. Yeah, I think that I can't see it changing considerably into the future. I think we kind of, well, again, it depends what happens with housing and immigration numbers and stuff like that. And kind of, I think when I was saying earlier, I think a lot of it is more to do with sort of density of housing and the proximity to more sensitive areas and things like that. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, something I guess for us all to keep an eye on. Okay, so Flo says, and this is probably, I imagine, for Becky as well. Flo says, a friend of mine told me about a study which GPS tracked dogs in areas with ground nesting birds and found that despite owners often believing that dogs accidentally come across nests, they actually entered hunting mode and zigzagged to intentionally find these nests. Is that something that you know about or have been involved in the research of?
I've not been involved in the research. I am aware of it. I don't think it was done in this country. But yeah, absolutely. Dogs are not, I mean, not all species. Many dog species are, sorry, dog breeds. I'm getting into it now. Many dog breeds will hunt by smell and by small amounts of movement and things like that. So they just have this kind of like predatory drive to be kind of like sniffing in the vegetation. And I think someone mentioned about hounds and things like that as well. And that's their kind of like way of moving through there. So absolutely, when we do our artificial nest predation experiment on Chobham Common this year, it's going to be fascinating to see about the behaviours of dogs. So we're going to have the camera trap set up so that we can see if a dog or any other animal approaches the nest or predates it. But we're also going to have our lovely undergraduate students stationed nearby to then watch when dogs are approaching and nearby. So yeah, there have been a few really interesting studies. There's a really great one about how dog visitation and dog activity is affecting I've forgotten the species now, nightjars. So there's been a couple of studies where they have actually sat there and studied the nests and monitored the actual nests and looked at the influence of dogs there, and obviously it's very negative. You know, they're obviously having a big effect on them.
Interesting. Somebody else has asked that do you think disturbance by dogs and people has a measurable impact on curlew and other wider declines, or do you think it is an issue of disturbance in combination with all the other issues rather than being a large issue itself? Does anyone want to come in on that one?
I think it's just another thing that feels like it's really against ground nesting birds and other wildlife. We know ground nesting birds in particular face all of these challenges in terms of land management, trees, all the things that we've talked about lots and lots of times. And I think people and dogs are another thing for them to contend with in their yearly struggle to try and get chicks off the ground. And I don't know the percentage of the impact, but I know that there's been nests on our land that were always deemed for failure because of their proximity to a footpath that wouldn't have been an issue 100 years ago, because there would have been loads more curlews and there would have been loads less people. So, you know, I can't discount it in any way, but it's kind of another small or large part of a bigger picture of problematic situations for waders and ground nesting birds.
Yeah, curlews face so many different things, and if we can make things even slightly easier for them, let's all do it. Becky.
Can I add to that? Sorry, I was just going to say, actually, when you look at these sorts of things, it's really difficult to disentangle the effects of lots of different stuff that's going on, especially for species that are migratory, when we don't really influence their summer, their overwintering grounds and things like that, and the effects of shooting and migration and things. But yeah, with curlews, it's going to be really difficult to kind of separate that out. But we have more of an influence over that kind of disturbance than we do anything else, you know, as landowners and land managers. So I think, you know, if we can sort of focus our attention on those types of behaviours and really working with dog owners and their education piece, and, you know, trying to make it as positive as possible and get those people to kind of engage with those landscapes and understand what the challenges are for those birds wider than just the dog walking. I think those sorts of things are so important.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so this might be our final question, and it's one for Nicola, and it's about the dog-friendly pop-up stalls. Is the response 100% positive, or does anyone feel that they shouldn't have to change their behaviours for the sake of wildlife? Do you think people underestimate the harm their dog can do?
Yeah, I think pretty much on the whole it's positive engagements via Heath and Hounds. I mean, people will generally just give the pop-up a wide berth if they have an idea about, you know, what we're going to be talking about, and they don't want to hear it, then they just won't come over and engage with us in the first place. But that's just part of being, you know, friendly and informative and having very sort of dog-friendly conversations and making a fuss of people's dogs to get them on board, you know, in the first place. Yeah, I mean, we've, as part of, I think, our Natural England Behavioural Insights research, they did run a survey, I think, at Horsell Common, and they kind of asked more in-depth questions to dog owners about what they understood about disturbance. And there was a reasonably good level of understanding. But the problem is a lot of people still said, I think other people are to blame for disturbance and not me or my dog. So obviously in the course of those conversations, while they're being questioned, their dogs are actually going off and running through the heather, you know, because they're distracted and the dog owner is not paying any attention. But I think there is this tendency for people to think they're doing the right thing. And I think for those breeds that may just literally venture a metre off the path, they really do not see the harm there. So it's a difficult concept to get your head around, isn't it, that you have a metre wide path, say, but you literally do not want your dog to step a metre off that path. So part of the messaging that we're sharing is that a nightjar nest can literally be a metre off a path, you know. And it's all about that visualization, that just because you can't see those birds and you can't see those nests does not mean that they're not there. So I think, yeah, there's very much a concept that I'm not doing any harm. I'm not seeing a bird flush up and my dog is not coming back with a bird in its mouth. Therefore, you know, I'm going home. My dog's enjoyed its walk, you know, tearing around, having a good run. It's exhausted. No harm done to anybody.
Yeah, it's a difficult message to communicate, but I think the idea that there could be a nightjar nest a metre off the path is something that is really exciting, I think. Yeah, that could be a great way of engaging people. Right, we are at, we've got less than a minute to go. So I want to say thank you so much to all three of our speakers. You've all been really excellent, had so many interesting things to say. So thank you so much for giving up your evening. And thank you everybody for coming along to the webinar this evening. I imagine Megan will be emailing around the recording of the webinar and information on the next one. So I'm going to let everybody go now. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.